$3 billion China investment plan for Brazil, the first yuan clearing bank in Latin America, and the possibility of a transcontinental railroad connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic. Just some of the deals announced during Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's first official trip to Brazil, Peru, Colombia and Chile. He is dubbed by many Chinese media outlets as the super salesman for what his country has to offer. He is accompanied by an entourage of Chinese business leaders in electricity, manufacturing, as well as financial institutions. The focus of his visit to Brazil and Peru is a feasibility study for a railroad that spans 5,000 kilometers with a budget of up to $10 billion US. While it would shorten transportation time and reduce the cost of shipping from Brazil to China, the rail link would also cut across the Amazon forest and is certain to raise concerns from environmentalists. To discuss Premier Li's visit to the continent is Charles Tang with us. He joins us from Rio de Janeiro. He is chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And from London, Francisco Dominguez, he is the head of the Center for Brazilian and Latin American Studies at Middlesex University. And from Beijing, Victor Gao, director of the China National Association of International Studies. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's start off with you, Mr. Tang, in Rio. You've been at this a long time. You actually established the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce back in 1986. You know, how different is the relationship now than back then, especially in light of Li Keqiang's visit?
Well, Premier Li Keqiang made quite a splash here in Brazil with all the agreements and the announcement and the investment announcement shortly after China Development Bank loaned $3.5 billion to Petrobras in this present situation of Brazil. It was really a boost of confidence for Brazil. Way back in 1986, when Vice Prime Minister Wu Zetian asked us to establish the Brazil-China Chamber to build the bridge of friendship between the two giants, nobody really wanted to know about China in those days because Brazil was a closed economy and China, of course, was very poor. Today, of course, everybody wants to know about China. And I think that the Chinese investments in Brazil can help this country and the whole continent of Latin America and Caribbean very much.
Francisco Dominguez in London, I just want to play for you a clip from Li Keqiang, because the relationship from the outside with Latin America has been seen one of natural resources, China buying a lot of agricultural and industrial products and then bringing in consumer goods. But the relationship on this visit seems to be changing and changing rapidly. Let's have a listen to the Chinese Premier.
Latin America cannot be the world's supplier of raw materials forever, and China cannot always be the world's factory of cheap goods. The trade model of mainly the exchanges of consumer goods for energy and mineral products is not sustainable.
Francisco Dominguez in London, is that where the relationship is going, moving away from just raw materials and Chinese consumer goods going into Latin America?
Yeah. Although there was an emphasis before on raw materials, I think the situation was never just about raw materials. In the last 10 years, China has contributed significantly to the infrastructural projects just about everywhere, where it can and where it is welcome, which is in most places in the region. However, there is this asymmetry between Latin America mainly selling raw materials and China buying them, which actually, when the prices, when the economy goes wrong in the world at a global level, then there are difficulties. And it seems to me that in this particular case, China now is trying to put back some of the resources to ensure that this massive injection of investment that is China is putting in many countries is going to sustain Latin America for this year. And I think the relationship has to change, and Latin America is already aware of this.
Yes, you can see it on this trip that both China and its Latin American partners want to avoid this sort of boom and bust. The big headline, of course, was this amazingly ambitious 5,000-kilometre railway project that could connect Brazil's Atlantic coast with the Pacific coast in Peru, maybe even further. I just want to play you what the Chinese Premier and the Brazilian President said to that, and then I'll get Victor Gao to comment in Beijing.
The railroad project connecting the Pacific and Atlantic will boost economic development in Brazil as well as other developing countries, and will be beneficial to leveling the playing field of world economies.
A new route to Asia will be open for Brazil, reducing distances and costs. A route that will take us directly to the Pacific Ocean and to the ports of Peru and China.
Victor Gao in Beijing, is this likely to actually happen? It's quite an incredible project and has got lots of people excited, but also people raising eyebrows about whether it's feasible.
Of course, this will be one of the mankind's largest engineering work. However, if you look at China's track record and the experience and the financing ability and the manufacturing capabilities, China has a proven record of being the fastest and the largest builder of such mega railway projects in China. And I think China has accumulated enough technological know-how and expertise, and also is armed with tremendous amount of financing capabilities. So it is the right time for China and the Latin American countries to work together to get this mega project done. I would say, in historical terms, if this project is to be completed, it will be the largest engineering project ever on the Latin American landmass after the carving and the completion of the Panama Canal. And I think this will bring tremendous amount of benefits to all the countries involved on the Latin American landmass, mainly because if you look at the geography of Latin America, it is separated into the western part and the eastern part by the Andes. But the western part is very narrow, and the eastern part is vast. But then access to Asia Pacific is relatively limited because of lack of connectivity from the vast eastern part of Latin American landmass with the Far East, especially in the China market.
Charles Tang, you're in Rio de Janeiro. What's the feeling there in Brazil on the ground? Is this going to go ahead? What are the problems? And is it, as Victor Gao says, something that China can really deliver for Latin America in a win-win situation?
Absolutely. I think, like Mr. Gao said, China does have the expertise to tackle these mind-boggling projects. Brazil has had a long dream of connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, or having a route through the Pacific. And Brazil and Argentina, but most of Latin America and the Caribbean, are very much enchanted by China's trade and much needed investments. Brazil and Latin America also look to the example of Africa, where the former colonial masters left the continent as a lost continent, stripped the continent of its wealth, and left the continent as a lost continent for many decades, until China started investing massively into Africa and transformed it into a continent of hope. And if you examine in the last 5 years, most of the fastest growing countries in the world are African countries where China has invested massively. And the recent help that China gave to Argentina certainly allowed Argentina to avoid any problems with default or anything like that. And I think that this present boost into Brazil is also very exciting.
Francisco Domingos in London, I want to bring you in here. You know, the railway project obviously captures a lot of attention. Is it an example of how China is trying to export the success it's had in its economy from the 1980s onwards into Latin America, which has had problems, as you know, breaking out of a sort of commodity-based economy across the region?
Absolutely. China, since 1978, when they began the economic reform, has taken 635 million people up to poverty. And anything that helps to eradicate poverty is something that is welcome in Latin America, especially in the latter period with all these many governments who are committed to growth and so on. Secondly, not only China has been able to do this, but it's been able to grow economically. The wisdom in the Western world has been that anything that is got to do with redistribution of income, growth, economic growth, investment, and so on, must be done at the expense of something else. And in this case, you can see that there is a win-win situation in the fact that not only China brings in their expertise, not only brings investment, not only provides credit, not only also brings technology, but is a source of tremendous cooperation with the region of the whole of Latin America. And in that sense, it seems to me that Latin America must welcome very much what is going on, precisely because it needs to deal with, centuries-long problems of asymmetries, poverty, lack of development, and these infrastructural projects not only are good in the sense that helps trade, but also in the sense that modernize and transform the economies for the better. That's why I think it's a good idea, and it's more welcome to have China coming in not only in Brazil to build this tremendous project, but also what they're doing in Nicaragua and the way they've helped Argentina and so on.
Yeah, there are parallels, aren't there, between lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China, which happened in the fastest pace, and also Latin America. Victor Gao, I want to bring you in here because all these projects and all this investment requires a sort of financial architecture that we not really see in terms of the World Bank and other vehicles. China is moving to try and create some of that in Latin America, a clearing bank for the Chinese currency, the yuan, in Chile. We're also seeing, of course, bringing in the BRICS Bank to help, and of course the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as well, which many Latin American countries have signed on as founding partners. Is this going to change the way that business is done in Latin America?
Well, first of all, I think for all these mega projects to be completed, you need tremendous amount of financing.
Yeah.
And there is no such precedent up to today. But I would say that China having the largest foreign currency reserve, and also is very, very financially rich in many other aspects, can really bring a lot of financial capability to help and work together with the Latin American countries. And also, allow me to use the example in the United States, the transcontinental railway system, linking the Pacific coast of the United States all the way to the Atlantic coast, built more than 100 years ago, has been helping improving the productivity for the United States for more than 100, and it will continue to play such a very important role for many, many decades to come. This is exactly why this transcontinental railway system linking the Latin America's Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast will be an investment for the coming 1 century or more for the sustainable growth of the Latin American landmass. That is why the investment is not purely for today or tomorrow. Yeah. The investment will be for several generations to come. And I think China is very much committed to use all its available financial wherewithal to help the Latin American brothers and sisters to get this mega deal done for mutual benefit, of course.
So we talked about the macroeconomic level, how the institutions are going to change, the size of these projects. Charles Tang, I just want to bring you in again from Rio. What do the Brazilian people feel about all this?
Well, the Brazilian people are very encouraged because under the present Brazilian crisis, China has confidence in Brazil and is willing to invest massively into Brazil. Like President Dilma's poverty eradication program needs capital. Brazil does not have the internal savings it needs to build its modern society. And like Mr. Dominguez said, China has lifted 690 million Chinese people from poverty, but it has also lifted hundreds of millions of Africans and South Americans, and the 40 million people that President Lula's government was able to include into the economy of Brazil are all examples of what China has been able to do with these economies by investing and by purchasing the increasing the trade. In 1999, trade between Brazil and China, two large continents, was only $1.5 billion. And now Last year, it reached almost $80 billion, and the year before last, it was $83.3 billion.
Yeah. What about the environmental concerns? Brazil, of course, home to some of the largest amount of rainforest in the world. This railway project, for example, would cut through some of that. What are Brazilians' fears and hopes in that area?
As you know, Brazil has extremely severe environmental laws. And any project to be undertaken in Brazil must respect these strict environmental laws. And I believe that this project, of course, will be built according to under Brazilian law, at least when it goes through Brazilian territory.
From Cisco Dominguez in London, we talked about this railway project, but there's other really quite exciting projects. You mentioned earlier the canal in Nicaragua, which could rival the Panama Canal. Is that the other one that's exciting the subcontinent? And there are others too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the investment involves $50 billion, which is about 4 times the GDP of the country. That gives you an idea of the scale of things that the Chinese are bringing in. And that's number one. Number two, in the first year of the implementation of the canal, about 250,000 new jobs are going to be created. And in the whole period of completion of the project, which is calculated to be about 5-6 years, something like 1 million new jobs directly are going to be created, plus the indirect jobs. So that would mean that actually Nicaragua is a very poor country now, and after the completion of the canal, just by the generation of jobs and by the actual work to build the canal, it's going to transform that country. Imagine the advantages that that country is going to have from there on when it begins to use it for trade and everything else. So that's why people are so excited. This scale, as well as, you know, the no conditions sort of policy of the Chinese when it comes to the question of bringing in investment, is only hard efficiency that they bring in, and in that sense, they're most welcome.
Victor Gao, I want to bring you in here. Is this a developing model for Chinese investment in Latin America, taking more into account countries' needs when it comes to employment and other aspects? Li Keqiang was at pains to stress that Chinese investment would also lead to more local jobs as opposed to Chinese workers being brought in. Of course, there'll be Chinese expertise on the ground as well. Is that a shift that we're seeing, a win-win situation again?
Of course, I think the key is to create a win-win situation so that both China wins and all the Latin American countries will also win. And this is possible mainly because China can bring in a total package. China is has the demand for many products and services, but China is the financier. China provides the technical know-how. China can also make many products together with the Latin American countries. So I would say this time, this win-win emphasis, and also helping the Latin American countries to create more jobs and good paying jobs will be crucially important. You mentioned about environmental protection. I think among all the modes of transportation, railway probably is the most efficient and the most environmentally friendly mode of transportation. But even based on that, we still need to give the top priority to environmental protection, especially if the railway line will go through the forest from Brazil all the way to the Pacific coast. So I would say that China and Latin American countries need to sit down together, very carefully go over all these details and make sure eventually all of us are winners. And Latin American countries get many jobs created, and poverty will be reduced and alleviated, and millions of people will be moved upward socially and economically. If China can do this, over the past 36 years, I truly believe people in Latin American countries can do equally well, if not even better.